Through the frost-etched windows of Blackwood Summit Resort, 12-year-old Tommy Sullivan pressed his face against the glass, his breath creating desperate clouds in the -18-degree air. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast golden light over America's wealthiest elite, feasting on Christmas delicacies worth more than most families' annual income. Outside, Tommy clutched a prescription bottle with shaking hands. His mother's cancer medication, the last hope for a woman who'd been dead for 3 days. Though he didn't know it yet. Harrison Blackwood III, seated at the head table in his $10,000 suit, noticed the pest at his window. His cold gray eyes lit up with familiar cruelty. After 40 years of building an empire on others' suffering, he recognized opportunity when it appeared. "Gentlemen," Harrison announced to his 40 guests, raising his wine glass, "it appears we have tonight's entertainment." The storm outside howled like souls seeking redemption. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Harrison Blackwood III had built his $2.8 billion empire on a simple philosophy: the weak existed to serve the strong. At 67, he owned 47 luxury resorts across North America, each one a monument to his belief that poverty was a moral failing. Tonight's Christmas gathering at his crown jewel, the Blackwood Summit Resort in Aspen, represented the pinnacle of American wealth. Tech moguls, oil executives, and politicians who collectively controlled more resources than small nations. The man himself cut an imposing figure in his custom Italian suit, silver hair perfectly styled, hands that had never known honest labor adorned with rings worth more than most people's homes. His guests knew him as ruthless but fair, a self-made billionaire who'd clawed his way from nothing to everything. What they didn't know was the ghost that haunted every Christmas Eve. The memory of his father, William Blackwood, a union steelworker who died of a heart attack on December 24, 1973, after losing his job 3 days before Christmas. That trauma had calcified into Harrison's core belief. Sentiment was weakness, and weakness was death. He'd divorced 3 wives who'd grown too soft, estranged his only son Michael, who'd chosen honor over success, and built his fortune by systematically destroying the very union his father had died defending. The William Blackwood Foundation, his supposed charitable arm, existed primarily to launder money and buy silence from those he'd crushed. Outside in the howling blizzard, 12-year-old Tommy Sullivan represented everything Harrison both feared and despised. The boy lived in a 1987 Toyota Camry with his mother, Sarah, who'd been battling stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 8 months. Tommy's father, David Sullivan, had died serving in Afghanistan when Tommy was 6, leaving behind a Purple Heart and a son with an extraordinary voice, the same angelic tenor that had once echoed through the steel mills of Pittsburgh when William Blackwood sang to keep his crew's spirits up. Tommy possessed what his father had called the voice of angels and the heart of lions. Taught by church choir directors before homelessness claimed his family, he could make grown men weep with hymns learned at his father's knee. But tonight, clutching his mother's medication and wearing shoes held together with duct tape, he represented something far more dangerous to Harrison's worldview, proof that circumstances, not character, determined fate. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, a pediatric oncologist seated among the guests, recognized Tommy immediately. She'd treated his mother until the family's insurance ran out 6 weeks ago. Marcus Webb, the resort's manager, also knew the boy. Marcus had grown up poor himself before Harrison's character-building programs had shaped him into a compliant enabler. As the storm raged outside, trapping everyone within the resort's walls, 3 generations of pain were about to collide in ways none of them could imagine. The grandfather clock in the resort's main dining hall had just chimed 6:30 when Harrison Blackwood III noticed the small figure pressed against the frosted windows. What started as mild annoyance quickly transformed into something far more sinister, an opportunity for what he called character building. His annual Christmas gathering had become legendary among America's elite, not just for the extravagant food and rare wines, but for Harrison's twisted tradition of finding ways to demonstrate the natural order between the powerful and the powerless. "Marcus," Harrison called to his resort manager, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience. "It appears we have an uninvited guest. Bring him inside." Marcus Webb, a lean man in his 40s who'd learned long ago not to question his employer's requests, hesitated for just a moment. He'd grown up poor himself in Denver, knew the desperation that drove children to press their faces against windows of wealth. But 40 years of working for Harrison had taught him that resistance was futile and employment was precious. "Sir, it's -18 degrees out there. The boy looks half frozen. Perhaps we should just bring him inside." Each word dropped like ice. "Our guests expect entertainment, and Providence has provided." The 40 assembled guests, tech billionaires from Silicon Valley, oil executives from Texas, pharmaceutical heiresses from Connecticut, began to murmur with anticipation. They'd heard stories of Harrison's lessons, but had never witnessed one firsthand. Some leaned forward with cruel curiosity, others shifted uncomfortably, but none dared object. In this rarefied world, Harrison Blackwood's word was law. Marcus trudged through the resort's ornate lobby, past Christmas decorations that cost more than most people's annual salaries, and opened the heavy oak doors. The wind immediately assaulted him with daggers of ice and snow. Tommy Sullivan stood hunched against the building, his thin frame shaking violently, his lips blue with cold. "Son," Marcus said, his voice gentle despite his employer's intentions, "you need to come inside before you freeze to death." Tommy looked up with eyes that held too much wisdom for a 12-year-old. In his trembling hands he clutched a prescription bottle with his mother's name on it, medication that cost $3,000, money they didn't have, for a woman who was already beyond saving, though Tommy clung to hope like a drowning man clutches driftwood. "Is this a hospital, sir?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible over the howling wind. "My mom, she needs her medicine, and I heard rich people sometimes help. Just come inside, son." "We'll figure something out." The moment Tommy stepped into the warm embrace of the resort's lobby, he was struck by wealth beyond his imagination. Crystal chandeliers that sparkled like captured stars. Marble floors so polished they reflected the Christmas tree that towered 20 feet high, adorned with ornaments that each cost more than his family's car. The smell of roasted duck and expensive wine filled the air, making his empty stomach clench with a hunger he'd been trying to ignore for 2 days. The dining hall fell silent as Marcus led Tommy into the lion's den. 40 pairs of eyes, some curious, some amused, some already ashamed of what they sensed was coming, fixed on the boy who looked like he'd stepped out of a Dickens novel. His shoes were held together with duct tape, his jacket was 3 sizes too large and patched with different colored fabric, and his thin frame spoke of too many missed meals. But it was his eyes that gave the guests pause. Despite his circumstances, Tommy Sullivan carried himself with a dignity that money couldn't buy. His father had been a decorated soldier, his mother a former elementary school teacher, and they'd raised him to believe that circumstances didn't define character, actions did. Harrison rose from his seat with theatrical flourish, his movements calculated to draw maximum attention. At 6'2", with silver hair and commanding presence, he dominated any room he entered. Tonight, in his custom black suit with diamond cufflinks that caught the light like captured fire, he looked like a king holding court. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of countless boardroom victories, "it appears we have a young entrepreneur in our midst. Tell us, boy, what exactly are you selling on this fine Christmas Eve?" Tommy's chin lifted slightly, a gesture his father had taught him when facing adversity. "I'm not selling anything, sir. I was hoping. My mother is very sick, and she needs medicine. I thought maybe someone here might know how I could earn enough money to—" "Earn?" Harrison's laugh was sharp as winter wind. "And what exactly do you propose to earn money with? What skills does a boy like you possess that would be of value to people like us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, who'd been watching with growing unease, started to rise from her seat, but Harrison's sharp look warned her to remain silent. Tommy straightened his shoulders, and for a moment the scared boy disappeared, replaced by something stronger. "My father always said I had his voice, sir. He used to sing in church before he deployed. Said music could heal hearts even when medicine couldn't heal bodies." "Your father?" Harrison's tone grew mockingly interested. "And where is this musical father of yours now?" "He died serving our country in Afghanistan, sir, when I was 6. A ripple of discomfort passed through the room. Even among this group of moral flexibility, the death of a soldier struck a chord. But Harrison pressed on, sensing weakness like a shark scenting blood. "How convenient. So you're an orphan with a voice, is that your story? And this sick mother, what's wrong with her?" Tommy's composure cracked slightly. "Cancer, sir. The doctors say. They say she doesn't have long if she can't get her treatments. And you thought you'd come to my resort, interrupt my guests' Christmas dinner, and what? Sing for your supper like some medieval minstrel?" The cruelty in Harrison's voice was unmistakable now. Several guests looked away, but others leaned forward, drawn to the spectacle like spectators at a gladiatorial match. Tommy's hands tightened around the prescription bottle, his lifeline to hope. "I know it sounds foolish, sir, but I have to try everything. She's all I have left." Harrison's smile was winter cold. "Well then, boy, let's see if your voice is worth $3,000. Sing for us. Sing like your mother's life depends on it." His pause was theatrical, cruel, because it does. The challenge hung in the air like a sword over Tommy's head. Around the room, 40 of America's most powerful people waited to see if a 12-year-old boy would sacrifice his dignity for a mother's life. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, trapping them all together in this moment of moral reckoning. Tommy looked around the room, seeing faces that ranged from eager cruelty to uncomfortable shame. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Son, when you're backed into a corner, that's when you find out what you're really made of." He took a deep breath, tasting the expensive air of the resort, and made his choice. Tommy Sullivan stood in the center of the opulent dining hall, 40 pairs of eyes boring into him like searchlights. The warmth of the room should have been comforting after the brutal cold outside, but instead it felt suffocating, heavy with expectation and cruelty. His small hands trembled as he clutched his mother's prescription bottle, the plastic warm against his palms from nervous energy. "Well?" Harrison's voice cut through the silence like a blade. "We're waiting, boy. You claim to have your father's voice. Let's see if dead soldiers sing better than live beggars." A collective intake of breath swept through the room. Even by Harrison's standards, the comment was particularly vicious. Dr. Elena Rodriguez half rose from her chair, her face flushed with indignation, but Marcus Webb caught her eye and shook his head almost imperceptibly. Everyone who knew Harrison understood the unspoken rule: interfere with his lessons, and you'd find yourself on the receiving end of his wrath. Tommy's jaw tightened. For a moment, the scared child disappeared entirely, replaced by something that looked remarkably like steel wrapped in small bones and threadbare clothing. His father's training kicked in. David Sullivan had been a soldier, but before that, he'd been a man who understood that sometimes dignity was the only weapon you had left. "What would you like me to sing, sir?" Tommy's voice was quiet but steady, carrying an undertone that made several guests shift uncomfortably. There was something unsettling about a child who could maintain composure under such circumstances. Harrison's smile widened, revealing teeth that had been straightened and whitened to perfection. "Something appropriate for the season, something that reminds us all of the spirit of Christmas." His tone dripped with mockery. "How about Silent Night? Surely even street children know that one." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Silent Night, a song about peace and heavenly grace, to be performed by a desperate child for the amusement of people who wouldn't pause their dinner to help a dying woman. Several guests looked down at their plates, suddenly finding their $30 per ounce Wagyu beef less appetizing. Tommy nodded slowly, then did something unexpected. He closed his eyes, not in defeat but in preparation. For a long moment he stood perfectly still, and the room held its collective breath. When he opened his eyes again, something fundamental had changed. The desperate boy was still there, but now he was accompanied by something else, a presence that seemed too large for his small frame. He began to sing. The first note that emerged from Tommy's throat was pure and clear as mountain snow, carrying a power that seemed impossible from such a small source. "Silent night, holy night." The words floated through the room like a physical presence, touching each person individually. But this wasn't the cheerful Christmas carol most people knew. This was something deeper, older, carved from pain and hope in equal measure. The effect was immediate and profound. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The clink of expensive crystal against china simply stopped. Even the storm outside seemed to quiet, as if nature itself had paused to listen. Harrison felt the first crack in his armor almost immediately. The voice, dear God, the voice. It was familiar in a way that made his chest tight. Memories he'd spent decades suppressing began to claw their way to the surface. Christmas Eve, 1973. His father, William Blackwood, singing this same song in their tiny apartment, trying to keep spirits up even though they had no money for presents, no money for anything except the hope that tomorrow might be better. "All is calm, all is bright." Tommy's voice grew stronger, more confident. He wasn't singing for the room anymore. He was singing for his father, for his mother, for something larger than the cruelty surrounding him. The lyrics took on new meaning, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the precision of someone who understood that music could be both weapon and sanctuary. Dr. Rodriguez felt tears spring to her eyes before she could stop them. She'd heard beautiful voices before. She lived in a world where children's hospital wards echoed with lullabies and prayers. But this was different. This boy was singing like his life depended on it, because it did. Every note carried the weight of desperation transformed into something transcendent. Around the room, 40 of America's most powerful people found themselves confronting something they'd forgotten existed: genuine emotion. These were individuals who lived in a world of calculated responses and strategic positioning where authenticity was a weakness to be exploited. But Tommy's voice cut through their defenses like a laser through fog. Marcus Webb, standing near the kitchen doors, felt his own childhood rushing back. He remembered being 10 years old in a Denver shelter, listening to his mother sing this same song on Christmas Eve because they had nothing else to give each other. He'd worked for 30 years to distance himself from that boy, to build walls between his past and present. Now those walls were crumbling with each note. round yon virgin, mother and child. The words seemed to hang in the air, and suddenly everyone in the room was thinking about mothers and children, about protection and love and the things that money couldn't buy or replace. Several of the women dabbed at their eyes with expensive napkins, while their husbands stared at their plates with expressions of profound discomfort. But it was Harrison who was experiencing the most violent internal upheaval. Each note from Tommy's throat was like a hammer blow to carefully constructed defenses. The boy's voice didn't just remind him of his father, it was his father's voice, echoing across 50 years of accumulated wealth and calculated cruelty. How was that possible? How could this street child possess the exact tonal quality, the same emotional resonance that had once been William Blackwood's gift to a world that had ultimately destroyed him? Holy infant, so tender and mild. Tommy's voice grew softer, more intimate, as if he were singing to someone specific. In his mind, he was singing to his mother, lying in a hospital bed 3 states away, alone because he was here chasing impossible dreams. He was singing to his father's grave in Arlington National Cemetery, where a folded flag was the only thing left of a man who died believing his son would carry on his legacy of service and honor. The contradiction in the room was becoming unbearable. Here was a child demonstrating more grace under pressure than most of these adults had ever shown in their lives, while they sat in judgment of his worthiness to receive basic human compassion. The cognitive dissonance was creating cracks in carefully maintained worldviews. Harrison's hands began to shake almost imperceptibly. The wine glass in his grip trembled as memories flooded back, not just of his father's voice but of his father's values. William Blackwood had been a man who shared his last dollar with neighbors in need, who organized food drives for unemployed workers, who believed that strength came from lifting others up rather than standing on their graves. When had Harrison forgotten those lessons? When had he decided that his father's kindness was weakness rather than wisdom? Sleep in heavenly peace. Tommy's voice reached its crescendo, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The final notes hung in the air like a benediction, blessing and condemning in equal measure. When the last echo faded into silence, no one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. 40 seconds passed in absolute quiet. Then from somewhere in the back of the room came the sound of slow, measured applause. Dr. Rodriguez was clapping, tears streaming down her face, her expression a mixture of admiration and defiance. One by one, other guests joined her, until the room thundered with applause that seemed less like appreciation than like an apology. But Harrison wasn't clapping. He sat frozen in his chair, staring at Tommy with an expression that might have been recognition, or horror, or something else entirely. Because in that moment, looking at the boy who'd just sung his father's song with his father's voice, Harrison Blackwood III realized he was staring at something impossible. He was staring at a ghost. The applause died away like the last notes of Tommy's song, leaving behind a silence that felt charged with electricity. Harrison remained frozen in his chair, his face pale as winter snow, while Tommy stood in the center of the room looking fragile and brave in equal measure. The boy's chest rose and fell rapidly, exhaustion from the performance and days without proper food finally catching up with him. Dr. Rodriguez was the first to break the spell. She rose from her table with determined grace, her medical instincts overriding social protocol. "That was extraordinary," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Absolutely extraordinary." She looked directly at Harrison, her dark eyes flashing with barely controlled anger. "I think this young man has more than earned whatever help we can provide." Several guests murmured agreement, but Harrison seemed not to hear them. His gaze remained fixed on Tommy with an intensity that was beginning to make people uncomfortable. There was something almost desperate in his stare, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that defied all logic. "What's your name again, boy?" Harrison's voice was rougher than before, stripped of its earlier mockery. Tommy straightened his shoulders, though the effort clearly cost him. "Tommy Sullivan, sir." "And your father's name?" "David Sullivan. He was a staff sergeant in the Army Rangers." Harrison's jaw worked silently for a moment. What was his full name? The question seemed odd to everyone in the room, but Tommy answered without hesitation. "David Michael Sullivan, sir. He changed his last name when he enlisted. Said he wanted to make his own way in the world, not rely on family connections." The wine glass in Harrison's hand slipped, crashing to the marble floor in an explosion of crystal and burgundy liquid that stained the white tablecloth like blood. Several guests gasped, but Harrison didn't seem to notice. His face had gone from pale to ash gray, and his hands were trembling visibly now. Marcus Webb hurried forward with a towel, but Harrison waved him away absently. "Michael," he whispered, the name barely audible. "Dear God, Michael." Dr. Rodriguez stepped closer to Tommy, her protective instincts fully engaged. Something was happening here that went beyond the evening's cruelty, and she didn't like the wild look in Harrison's eyes. "Tommy, honey, when did you last eat?" Tommy's stomach chose that moment to growl audibly, a sound that seemed to echo through the silent room like an accusation. "2 days ago, ma'am. I gave my last food to my mother." 2 days? Dr. Rodriguez's voice rose in outrage. She spun to face Harrison. "This child hasn't eaten in 2 days, and you've been playing games with him." "What kind of monster—" "Michael Blackwood," Harrison interrupted, his voice stronger now but hollow as an empty grave. "His name was Michael Blackwood. My son who I drove away 13 years ago because he wanted to serve his country instead of joining my business empire. My son who I told was dead to me when he walked out that door." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Several guests leaned forward, sensing they were witnessing something historic. The great Harrison Blackwood admitting to a vulnerability, to a failure that cut deeper than any business loss. Tommy's eyes widened with confusion and something that might have been hope. You knew my dad?" Harrison laughed, but it was a broken sound like glass grinding against stone. "Knew him? Boy, I destroyed him. I destroyed my own son because I was so afraid of him becoming soft, becoming weak, becoming like—" He stopped abruptly, as if the words were too dangerous to speak aloud. "Like what, doctor?" Rodriguez demanded, her protective stance never wavering. "Like my father," Harrison whispered. "Like William Blackwood, who died poor and broken because he cared more about other people than himself. I swore I'd never let sentiment make me weak. I built this empire by being harder than the world that killed my father. And when my son chose honor over profit, I threw him away like garbage." The confession hung in the air like a thunderclap. 40 of America's most powerful people sat in stunned silence as they watched one of their own strip himself bare, revealing the rotting foundation beneath his gleaming empire. Tommy took a step forward, his young face struggling to process this revelation. "He never told me about you. He just said his father was dead, that his real family was the Army and then us, me and Mom." "Because I was dead to him," Harrison said, his voice cracking. "I made sure of that. When he came to me before his deployment to Afghanistan, wanting to introduce me to his wife, to show me pictures of his baby son, Harrison's hands covered his face. "I threw him out, told him he was no son of mine, told him that soldiers were just failed businessmen who couldn't make it in the real world." Dr. Rodriguez gasped audibly. "Your own son, going to war, and you—" "I destroyed him," Harrison finished. Just like I destroyed my father's memory. Just like I've destroyed everything I've ever touched. He looked up at Tommy with eyes that seemed to hold 50 years of regret. Your father died believing his own father hated him. And now his son stands here, begging for scraps from the man who made sure his father died alone. The room had gone completely silent except for the storm raging outside. Even the servers had stopped moving, frozen by the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Tommy stood in the center of it all, a 12-year-old boy, trying to process the fact that his grandfather, the grandfather he'd never known existed, was the richest man in the room, and possibly the cruelest. "He wasn't weak," Tommy said suddenly, his voice clear and strong despite his exhaustion. "My dad wasn't weak. He saved 6 men in his unit before the roadside bomb. They gave him the Purple Heart posthumously. Mom said he died doing what he loved, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." Each word hit Harrison like a physical blow. His son had died a hero, protecting others, living the values that William Blackwood had tried to instill in his own son decades ago. The values Harrison had rejected as weakness were the very ones that had made Michael into the man Harrison himself could never become. "And Mom," Tommy continued, his voice beginning to waver as emotion finally broke through his composure. "Mom never said a bad word about anyone. Even when we lost the house, even when she got so sick she couldn't work, she always said we had to be grateful for what we had. She said Dad was watching over us, making sure we'd be okay." "Where is your mother now?" Dr. Rodriguez asked gently, though something in her expression suggested she already suspected the answer. Tommy's face crumpled slightly. "At St. Mary's Hospital in Denver. The doctor said, they said if she doesn't get the new treatment, she only has a few days left. That's why I came here. Someone said rich people sometimes help with medical bills, and I thought maybe—" His voice trailed off as the impossibility of his situation crashed over him again. Harrison was staring at his grandson, dear God, with an expression of absolute devastation. "How much?" he asked quietly. "Sir, how much for the treatment?" Tommy's hand tightened around the prescription bottle. $15,000 for the first round. "But the doctor said it might take 3 rounds and there's no guarantee." He stopped, seeing something dangerous flickering in Harrison's eyes. "Marcus," Harrison said, his voice carrying the authority of absolute command, "get my helicopter pilot on the phone, now." Marcus blinked in confusion. "Sir, there's a blizzard. I don't care if there's a hurricane. Get him on the phone." Harrison stood abruptly, his movements sharp with sudden purpose. "And call Dr. Cameron at Denver General. Tell him Harrison Blackwood needs a favor, and money is no object." Dr. Rodriguez stepped protectively closer to Tommy. "What are you planning?" Harrison looked at her, and for the first time all evening his expression held something other than cruelty or pain. It held determination. "I'm planning to do what I should have done 13 years ago. I'm planning to take care of my family." The words fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled guests. Tommy looked up at his grandfather with confusion, hope, and wariness warring in his young face. "Does this mean—" Tommy began, then stopped as if afraid to voice the question. "It means," Harrison said, his voice steadier than it had been all evening, "that your grandmother was right. Sometimes angels do sing when someone's about to go home. But this time, we're going to make sure it's a homecoming, not a farewell." The transformation in Harrison Blackwood was so sudden and complete that several guests wondered if they were witnessing some kind of breakdown. The man who moments ago had been orchestrating a child's humiliation now moved with the focused intensity of a general preparing for battle. His commands came rapid fire, each one delivered with the absolute authority that had built his empire. "Marcus, I need 3 things immediately," Harrison barked, his voice cutting through the stunned silence. "First, Get Denver General's chief of oncology on the line. Tell him Harrison Blackwood is authorizing unlimited funding for Sarah Sullivan's treatment. Second, arrange ground transport. If we can't fly in this storm, we drive. Third, clear the presidential suite and have medical equipment brought up immediately. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process the complete reversal of his employer's personality. In 30 years of working for Harrison, he'd never seen the man show genuine concern for anyone, let alone a dying stranger and her homeless son. "Move!" Harrison's shout jolted Marcus into action. He fumbled for his phone, fingers shaking as he began making calls. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, her medical training taking precedence over social dynamics. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to examine Tommy. He's showing signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition. Before we make any plans, we need to make sure he's stable enough for whatever you're proposing." Tommy swayed slightly on his feet, the adrenaline from his performance finally wearing off and leaving him feeling hollow and weak. The prescription bottle slipped from his numb fingers, clattering across the marble floor. The sound seemed to echo through the room like a gunshot, reminding everyone of the desperation that had brought him here. Harrison moved faster than anyone expected, catching Tommy just as the boy's knees buckled. For a moment, grandfather and grandson were face to face, and the resemblance was unmistakable. They had the same eyes, gray-blue like storm clouds, and the same stubborn set to their jaws. But where Harrison's face was lined with decades of calculated cruelty, Tommy's still held the innocence of childhood, despite everything he'd endured. "When did you last drink water?" Harrison asked, his voice gentle in a way that shocked the room. Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. "This morning, I think, from a fountain at the bus station." Harrison's face darkened with fury. Not at Tommy, but at himself, at a world that could reduce a child to such desperation. "Someone get this boy water, now. And food, real food, not those fancy appetizers." The kitchen staff, who'd been watching through the service doors, sprang into action. Within minutes, a simple meal appeared. Soup, bread, milk, foods that wouldn't shock Tommy's empty stomach. As the boy ate with careful, measured bites, Harrison found himself studying every gesture, looking for traces of the son he'd driven away. Dr. Rodriguez took Tommy's pulse and checked his vitals while he ate, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "He needs IV fluids," she murmured to Harrison. "His blood pressure is dangerously low and his heart rate is elevated. This child has been running on willpower alone." "Then we get him fluids," Harrison said simply. "Whatever he needs." The guests around the room watched this drama unfold with varying degrees of fascination and discomfort. Some of the younger tech executives were openly recording with their phones, sensing they were witnessing a moment that would become legendary. Others, particularly the older industrialists who'd known Harrison for decades, looked deeply unsettled by his transformation. "Marcus," one oil executive called out, "perhaps we should discuss this privately. Harrison might not be thinking clearly." "Harrison is thinking more clearly than he has in 50 years. Harrison cut him off, his voice carrying a warning that made the man shrink back into his seat. "Anyone who has a problem with how I choose to spend my money is welcome to leave." The threat hung in the air like a sword. These people were Harrison's business partners, his social circle, his world. But in this moment, he was choosing a homeless 12-year-old over all of them, and everyone in the room understood the magnitude of that choice. Tommy looked up from his soup, milk leaving a white mustache on his upper lip that made him look even younger than his 12 years. "Sir, Mr. Blackwood, are you really my grandfather?" The question cut through the room's tension like a blade. Harrison pulled up a chair next to Tommy, sitting down so they were at eye level. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 13 years of regret. "Yes, son, I am. And I'm the biggest fool who ever lived for not knowing you existed." Harrison's hands trembled as he reached out to touch Tommy's face, then stopped himself. "Your father, my son Michael. He tried to tell me about you, tried to show me pictures. I was so angry, so determined to punish him for choosing the army over my business, that I threw him out before he could say your name." Tommy's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. "He never stopped loving you. Even after he came back from his first deployment, he'd talk about his father sometimes. Mom said he kept hoping you'd change your mind, that you'd want to meet me." Each word was another nail in the coffin of Harrison's old life. The man who'd spent decades convincing himself that sentiment was weakness now found himself drowning in the realization of what his hardness had cost him. He'd lost his son, never met his grandson, and was about to lose his daughter-in-law without ever knowing her. "Tell me about her," Harrison said suddenly. "Tell me about your mother." Tommy's face lit up despite his exhaustion. "She's the best person in the world. When Dad died, she could have been angry or bitter, but she took care of me. She worked 3 jobs to keep us in our house until she got too sick. Even when we were living in the car, she made sure I kept going to school. She said education was the one thing no one could take away from me." "What did she do for work?" "She was a teacher. 3rd grade. Her students loved her. When she got sick, some of their parents tried to help with medical bills, but—" Tommy's voice trailed off. "It's expensive to die in America." The bitter truth of that statement hung in the air. Around the room, 40 people who collectively controlled billions of dollars sat in uncomfortable silence, confronted with the reality that in the wealthiest nation on earth, a child could be reduced to begging for his mother's life. Marcus appeared at Harrison's elbow, his face pale with the weight of the information he carried. "Sir, I have Dr. Cameron from Denver General on the line, and sir, about Mrs. Sullivan." Something in Marcus's tone made Harrison's blood turn to ice. "What about her?" Marcus glanced nervously at Tommy, who was listening with the intensity of someone whose world hung in the balance. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "No," Tommy interrupted, his voice surprisingly strong. "If it's about my mom, I need to know. I'm not a baby." Harrison felt a surge of pride at his grandson's courage, followed immediately by terror at what Marcus might reveal. "Tell us," he said quietly. Marcus took a deep breath. "Doctor." "Cameron says Sarah Sullivan was admitted to the ICU 3 days ago. She's in a coma, sir. The cancer has spread to her brain. The hospital has been trying to locate next of kin." The words hit Tommy like a physical blow. The spoon fell from his hand, clattering into the soup bowl as his face went white as snow. 3 days? She's been alone for 3 days? "Son," Harrison said, reaching out instinctively, but Tommy jerked away. "I have to go to her. I have to go right now." Tommy tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't support him. "She's waiting for me. She doesn't know where I am." The raw anguish in the boy's voice cut through every heart in the room. Even the most hardened executives found themselves blinking back tears as they watched a child confront the reality that his mother, his only family, his whole world, was dying alone while he'd been here, unknowingly performing for the very family that had abandoned them. "Doctor." Rodriguez moved quickly to Tommy's side, her professional calm masking her own emotional turmoil. "Tommy, honey, we need to get you some medical attention before we can travel anywhere. You're in no condition to—" "I don't care!" Tommy's voice rose to a shout, startling everyone. "I don't care about me! She needs me! She's been alone for 3 days thinking I abandoned her!" The words hung in the air like an accusation, and Harrison felt them like a knife to the heart. Abandonment. The family curse. He'd abandoned his son, who died believing his father hated him. Now that same son's child was facing the possibility that he'd abandoned his mother in her final moments. "We'll go," Harrison said suddenly, his voice cutting through Tommy's sobs. "We'll go right now." "Sir," Marcus protested, "the storm—" "I don't care about the storm. Get the best vehicle we have. Get emergency medical equipment. Get whatever doctor—" Rodriguez needs to keep Tommy stable during the trip. Harrison stood, and suddenly he was the commanding presence who'd built an empire, but now channeling that power toward salvation instead of destruction. "My grandson is going to see his mother tonight." The room erupted in voices, protests about safety, about the impossibility of traveling in a blizzard, about liability and insurance, and a dozen other practical concerns. But Harrison's voice cut through them all. "Anyone who wants to help is welcome. Anyone who wants to object can leave. But Tommy Sullivan is going to Denver tonight, even if I have to drive through hell to get him there." Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury, as if nature itself was testing the resolve of this unlikely family reunion. But inside the resort, something had shifted fundamentally. The evening that had begun with casual cruelty was transforming into something else entirely, a desperate race against time, weather, and the accumulated sins of a lifetime. The news about Sarah Sullivan's condition had transformed the opulent dining hall into something resembling a war room. Tommy sat hunched in his chair, tears streaming down his face as the full weight of his mother's situation crashed over him. For 3 days, while he'd been desperately trying to raise money for medicine, she'd been lying unconscious in a hospital bed, alone and unreachable. 3 days, he whispered, his voice broken. "I told her I'd be back in 2 days. She's been waiting for me." Harrison knelt beside his grandson's chair, his expensive suit forgotten as he faced the wreckage of his family's legacy. "Son, listen to me. Your mother knows you love her. She knows you'd move heaven and earth to be with her." "But I wasn't there when she needed me most," Tommy sobbed. "I was here singing for money like some kind of circus animal while she was dying alone." The words hit Harrison like physical blows. His grandson was experiencing the same guilt that had haunted Harrison for decades, the terrible weight of being absent when family needed you most. The pattern was repeating itself with devastating precision. William Blackwood dying alone while his son chased success. Michael Blackwood dying in Afghanistan believing his father hated him, and now Sarah Sullivan dying while her son begged strangers for help. Dr. Rodriguez moved efficiently around Tommy, checking his pulse and blood pressure while maintaining a steady stream of gentle reassurance. "Tommy, honey, being in a coma doesn't mean she doesn't know you're thinking about her. Sometimes people in comas can hear more than we realize." "Is that true?" Tommy looked up with desperate hope. "It's absolutely true," she replied firmly, though her medical training told her that Sarah Sullivan's condition was likely beyond hope. "And right now, the best thing you can do for your mother is take care of yourself so you can be strong for her." Marcus appeared at Harrison's elbow, his phone pressed to his ear, and his face grim with concentration. "Sir, I have updates. The good news is that Dr. Cameron has confirmed Mrs. Sullivan's location and medical status. The bad news is that Interstate 70 is completely shut down. State Patrol says no vehicles are being allowed through." Harrison's face darkened with the kind of fury that had once destroyed business rivals and political opponents. "Then we go around it, or through it. I don't care if we have to buy the entire Colorado National Guard." "Sir," Marcus interrupted gently, "there is no around it. The entire Colorado mountain region is under a blizzard warning. Winds are gusting up to 80 miles per hour, and visibility is near zero. Even our best drivers couldn't navigate those roads safely." The room fell silent except for the howling wind outside and Tommy's quiet sobs. 40 of America's most powerful people sat helplessly as they confronted something that money and influence couldn't overcome: nature's indifference to human desperation. "There has to be something," Harrison said, his voice carrying an edge of desperation that his guests had never heard before. "Military transport, emergency services? I'll pay whatever it takes." Dr. Rodriguez looked up from her examination of Tommy, her expression grave. "Mr. Blackwood, even if we could get through, Tommy needs medical attention now. His blood pressure is dangerously low, and he's showing signs of severe dehydration. Moving him in his current condition, especially in this weather, could be life-threatening." "Then we treat him here," Harrison said immediately. "Whatever equipment you need, whatever medication—" "I don't want treatment!" Tommy suddenly exploded, startling everyone in the room. "I want my mom. I want to be with her." His small fists pounded against the chair arms as months of suppressed terror and grief poured out. "She's dying, and I'm not there, and it's all my fault." The anguish in the child's voice was so raw, so primal, that several guests turned away, unable to bear witness to such pain. This wasn't the sanitized tragedy they were used to seeing on charity gala videos. This was real suffering, immediate and devastating. Harrison felt something break inside his chest as he watched his grandson's breakdown. This was his fault, every bit of it. If he hadn't driven Michael away, if he'd been the father and grandfather he should have been, none of this would have happened. Sarah wouldn't have been struggling alone, Tommy wouldn't have been living in a car, and they wouldn't be trapped here while she died without them. "It's not your fault," Harrison said, his voice thick with his own unshed tears. "None of this is your fault. It's mine." Tommy looked up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "How is it your fault? You didn't even know we existed." "Because I should have known," Harrison replied, the words torn from the depths of his soul. "I should have found a way to forgive your father. I should have been there when you were born, when he deployed, when your mother got sick. I should have been a grandfather instead of a stranger." Around the room, Harrison's confession was having an unexpected effect on his guests. These were people who'd spent their lives accumulating power and wealth, often at the expense of personal relationships. Watching Harrison confront the cost of his choices was forcing them to examine their own lives, their own absent children and estranged relatives. Dr. Rodriguez cleared her throat, drawing attention back to the immediate crisis. "Mr. Blackwood, I need to be direct with you. Based on what the hospital told Marcus, Mrs. Sullivan's condition is very grave. Even with unlimited medical resources, the chances of meaningful recovery are—" She paused, glancing at Tommy's tear-streaked face. "Say it," Tommy whispered. "Please. I need to know the truth." Dr. Rodriguez knelt down to Tommy's level, her voice gentle but honest. "Your mother has been fighting this cancer for a long time. The fact that it's reached her brain and caused a coma means her body is very tired. Sometimes, even with the best medical care, there comes a point where the kindest thing is to make sure someone isn't in pain rather than trying to prolong their suffering." Tommy's face crumpled as the full implications hit him. "So she's going to die, no matter what we do?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know that right now, the most important thing is that she knows she's loved. And that you take care of yourself, because that's what she'd want." The storm outside seemed to intensify, as if nature was responding to the tragedy unfolding within the resort's walls. The wind howled against the windows with such force that the glass rattled in its frames, while snow piled up against the doors like prison walls. Harrison stood abruptly, his movement sharp with sudden determination. "Marcus, get me a satellite phone. I want to talk to the governor, the National Guard, anyone with emergency authority." "Sir, even emergency services aren't operating in these conditions." "Then we wait," Harrison said, his voice carrying a finality that brooked no argument. "We wait until the storm passes, and then we move heaven and earth to get to Denver. In the meantime, we take care of Tommy, and we find a way to let his mother know that he's safe and that he loves her." Tommy looked up hopefully. Can we really call her? Can we talk to her? Doctor. Rodriguez hesitated, then nodded slowly. Hospitals usually allow phone calls to coma patients. The staff can hold the phone so she can hear your voice. There's evidence that familiar voices can sometimes reach people even in deep unconsciousness. For the first time since learning about his mother's condition, Tommy's face showed a glimmer of hope. She'd hear me, even if she can't answer? She might, Dr. Rodriguez said carefully. And even if she can't respond, hearing that you're safe and that you love her could give her peace. Harrison felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. It wasn't the reunion he'd imagined. It wasn't the dramatic rescue he'd wanted to orchestrate, but it was something. It was a chance for Tommy to connect with his mother, to ease both their suffering, even if only slightly. "Make the call," Harrison ordered Marcus. "Get the hospital on the line." Tommy's going to talk to his mother. As Marcus began dialing, Tommy wiped his eyes and tried to compose himself. "What should I say to her?" Harrison looked at his grandson, really looked at him, and saw not just Michael's eyes and William's voice, but also a strength that transcended generations. Despite everything this child had endured, he was still thinking about comforting his dying mother rather than his own grief. "Tell her the truth," Harrison said softly. "Tell her you love her. Tell her you're safe. And tell her—" His voice caught slightly. "Tell her that her family is going to take care of you." Around the room, 40 witnesses to this private tragedy found themselves holding their breath as a 12-year-old boy prepared to say goodbye to the only parent he'd ever known, while a storm raged outside and inside the heart of a man finally learning what it meant to put family before fortune. The satellite phone crackled to life in Marcus's hands, the connection weak but audible against the backdrop of the howling storm. As he spoke with the hospital staff, arranging for Tommy to speak with his unconscious mother, Harrison found himself studying his grandson's face with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Every gesture, every expression seemed to carry echoes of the son he'd lost and the father he'd failed to honor. "They're connecting us to the ICU now," Marcus announced, his voice carefully controlled. "The nurse will hold the phone near your mother's ear so she can hear you." Tommy's hands trembled as he reached for the phone, and for a moment he seemed to shrink back into the frightened child who'd first appeared at the window. "What if she can't hear me? What if it's too late?" Dr. Rodriguez placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Honey, love doesn't have deadlines." "Whatever you say, it comes from your heart, and hearts always know the truth." Harrison watched this exchange with growing anguish. Here was his grandson, showing more courage in the face of devastating loss than Harrison had demonstrated in decades of business triumphs. The contrast was overwhelming. A 12-year-old preparing to say goodbye to his dying mother while surrounded by strangers, displaying a grace that had taken Harrison 70 years to even glimpse. "Mrs. Sullivan," came a nurse's voice through the phone's tinny speaker, "your son Tommy is on the line. He wants to talk to you." The room fell completely silent. 40 of America's most powerful people, accustomed to commanding attention and controlling conversations, sat as still as statues while a homeless child prepared to pour his heart out to a dying woman 300 miles away. Tommy took the phone with shaking hands, closed his eyes, and began to speak. "Hi, Mom. It's me." "It's Tommy." His voice was soft but clear, carrying across the phone line like a prayer. "I'm sorry I'm not there with you. I'm sorry I broke my promise about coming back in 2 days." Harrison felt his chest constrict as he listened to his grandson's words. The pain in the boy's voice was almost unbearable, but there was something else there too. A maturity born of loss, a strength forged in the crucible of abandonment and desperation. "I'm safe, Mom. I'm in this big fancy place in Aspen, and there are people here who are taking care of me. I know you'd worry about me being with strangers, but they're family, Mom. Dad's family. I found Dad's father, and he's going to help us." Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably as they realized they were witnessing something profoundly intimate. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was a child saying goodbye to his mother, speaking words that carried the weight of a lifetime's love compressed into what might be their final conversation. Harrison found himself hanging on every word, desperate to understand what kind of woman had raised this extraordinary child alone. Through Tommy's gentle monologue, a picture emerged of Sarah Sullivan. A teacher who'd sacrificed everything for her son, a widow who'd kept her husband's memory alive, a mother who'd faced poverty and illness with unshakable dignity. "Do you remember that song Dad used to sing?" Tommy continued, his voice growing stronger. "The one about finding your way home. I sang it tonight, Mom. I sang it for all these people, and it made them cry because it was so beautiful. Dad's voice coming through me to reach their hearts." He paused, listening to something only he could hear. "I know you can't answer, but I feel you listening." "I feel you and Dad both listening." Dr. Rodriguez wiped tears from her eyes as she monitored Tommy's vital signs. His heart rate had actually stabilized during the phone call, as if the connection with his mother was providing the strength his body needed to endure. "I met my grandfather tonight, Mom. Dad's dad. His name is Harrison. And he's really rich. But more important, he's sorry. He's sorry he never knew Dad loved him. He's sorry he never got to meet you or me. And Mom," Tommy's voice broke slightly, "he's going to take care of me. I won't be alone." Harrison felt as if his heart might explode from the pressure building in his chest. The casual way Tommy spoke of not being alone, as if it were a gift he was giving his dying mother rather than something he desperately needed himself, revealed a selflessness that humbled every adult in the room. The storm outside seemed to pause as Tommy continued speaking, his words creating a bubble of sacred space in the midst of chaos. "I love you, Mom. I love you more than all the stars in the sky, just like you used to tell me. And when you see Dad again, tell him I kept my promise. Tell him I sang with his voice, and I made people remember what love sounds like." Marcus, who'd been holding himself rigidly professional throughout the evening, found tears streaming down his face. Around the room, billionaires and business titans sat in stunned silence, many of them confronting emotions they'd spent lifetimes suppressing. "The nurse says your mom's heart rate increased when you started talking," Dr. Rodriguez whispered to Tommy. "She's responding to your voice." Tommy's face lit up with desperate hope. "Really? She can hear me?" "Her body is responding to the sound of your voice," Dr. Rodriguez explained carefully. "It means some part of her recognizes you, even in her unconscious state." Tommy pressed the phone closer to his ear, as if trying to climb through it to reach his mother. "Mom, if you can hear me, I need you to know something. I need you to know that it's okay. It's okay if you need to go be with Dad. I'll miss you every day for the rest of my life, but I understand if you're tired. I understand if the fight is too hard." Harrison's breath caught in his throat. The boy was giving his mother permission to die, 12 years old, and he was offering the kind of grace that most adults never achieved. The courage it took to speak those words, to release the person he loved most in the world, was staggering. "But Mom," Tommy continued, his voice stronger now, "I also need you to know that I'm going to be okay. I'm going to finish school like you wanted. I'm going to sing Dad's songs and keep his memory alive. And I'm going to learn about this family I never knew I had so I can tell you all about them when I see you again." The phone crackled, and suddenly a new voice came through. Dr. Cameron from Denver General. "Is this Tommy Sullivan?" "Yes, sir," Tommy replied, his formality touching in its politeness. "Son, I'm Dr. Cameron. I've been taking care of your mother. I want you to know that she's not in any pain right now. We're making sure she's comfortable, and her vital signs showed significant improvement while you were talking to her." "Does that mean she's getting better?" The hope in Tommy's voice was almost painful to hear. Dr. Cameron paused, and Harrison could hear the weight of difficult decisions in that silence. "It means she knows you're there, son. It means your voice is reaching her even if she can't respond." Tommy nodded, even though the doctor couldn't see him. "Thank you for taking care of her. Thank you for making sure she's not afraid." "You're very welcome, son. Is there an adult there who can speak with me about your mother's care?" Harrison stepped forward, taking the phone from Tommy's reluctant hands. "Dr. Cameron, this is Harrison Blackwood. I'm Tommy's grandfather. Whatever my daughter-in-law needs, whatever it costs, I want it done." "Mr. Blackwood," Dr. Cameron's voice carried a mixture of relief and concern. "I'm glad Tommy has family with him, but I need to be honest about Mrs. Sullivan's condition. The cancer has progressed significantly, and while we can keep her comfortable, the chances of recovery are—" "I understand," Harrison cut him off, glancing at Tommy, who was straining to hear every word. "We'll discuss details later. Right now, what can we do for her tonight?" "Continue talking to her. Let her hear familiar voices. And Mr. Blackwood, if you're planning to come to Denver, don't wait too long." The implication hung in the air like a death sentence. Harrison looked at his grandson, who'd caught enough of the conversation to understand that time was running out. The boy's face had gone pale, but his jaw was set with determination that Harrison recognized. It was the same stubborn strength that had driven 3 generations of Blackwood men, though Tommy was channeling it toward love rather than conquest. "We'll be there as soon as the storm breaks," Harrison promised, "whatever it takes." As he handed the phone back to Tommy for a final goodbye, Harrison realized that everything he'd thought he understood about strength, about success, about what made a man worthy of respect, had been completely wrong. Real strength wasn't about accumulating power over others. It was about having the courage to love someone more than you loved yourself, even when that love led to devastating loss. And in that moment, watching his 12-year-old grandson demonstrate more grace under pressure than Harrison had shown in 7 decades of life, the old man finally understood what his father had been trying to teach him all those years ago. The phone call ended with Tommy whispering, "I love you, Mom," one final time, his small voice carrying across 300 miles of Colorado wilderness to reach a woman who might already be beyond reach. As he handed the phone back to Marcus, his composure finally cracked completely. The brave front he'd maintained throughout the evening collapsed like a dam bursting, and he sobbed with the raw anguish of a child who just said what might be his final goodbye to his mother. Harrison moved without thinking, wrapping his arms around his grandson for the first time. The boy felt impossibly small and fragile against his chest, all sharp angles and hollow spaces where proper meals should have filled him out. For a moment, Tommy stiffened, unused to comfort from strangers, but then he melted into his grandfather's embrace with desperate gratitude. "She's really going to die, isn't she?" Tommy whispered against Harrison's expensive jacket, leaving tear stains on fabric that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Harrison's throat worked silently for several seconds before he could force words past the boulder of emotion lodged there. "I don't know, son, but I do know that she heard you. I know that she understands how much you love her, and I know that no matter what happens, you're not alone anymore." Around the room, 40 witnesses to this private tragedy sat in profound discomfort. These were people accustomed to controlling narratives, to managing outcomes, to wielding influence that could reshape industries and topple governments. But here they sat, helpless observers to suffering that all their combined wealth couldn't alleviate. The storm outside had trapped them in this moment of reckoning, forcing them to confront the brutal reality that money and power were meaningless when measured against a child's love for his dying mother. Dr. Rodriguez approached quietly, her medical bag in hand. "Tommy, honey, I need to get some fluids into you. You're dehydrated and stress is making it worse. Will you let me start an IV?" Tommy pulled back from Harrison's embrace, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "Will it hurt?" "Just a little pinch. But it'll help you feel stronger, and we need you strong for when we can get to Denver." As Dr. Rodriguez prepared the IV, Tommy looked around the room for the first time since the phone call, really seeing the assembled faces. Some guests avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with the raw emotion they'd witnessed. Others looked back with expressions ranging from sympathy to barely controlled tears. A few of the younger tech executives were still recording, though their enthusiasm for content creation had clearly dimmed in the face of real human suffering. "I'm sorry," Tommy said suddenly, his voice small but clear. "I'm sorry for crying in front of everyone. I know this was supposed to be your party." The apology hit the room like a thunderclap. Here was a child who'd just learned his mother was dying, apologizing to the people who'd spent the evening treating him like entertainment. The contrast between his grace and their earlier cruelty was so stark that several guests actually winced. "Son," Harrison said, his voice rough with emotion, "you have nothing to apologize for. Nothing at all." He turned to face his guests, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority that had built an empire. "If anyone should be apologizing, it's me, to all of you, for subjecting you to my twisted idea of entertainment, and to Tommy for everything." One of the oil executives, a man named Richardson, who'd known Harrison for 20 years, cleared his throat nervously. "Harrison, perhaps we should discuss this privately. You're clearly emotional, and decisions made in emotional states are often the first honest decisions a man makes in his life." Harrison cut him off. "Richardson, you've known me for 2 decades. In all that time, have you ever seen me show genuine concern for another human being?" Richardson shifted uncomfortably. "Well, Have you?" Harrison's voice was implacable. "No," Richardson admitted quietly. "Then maybe it's time you did." Harrison's gaze swept the room, taking in faces that had shared countless business dinners, golf games, and strategy sessions. "Maybe it's time all of you saw what a human being looks like when he stops pretending that money is more important than family, Dr." Rodriguez had finished inserting the IV into Tommy's arm, and the boy was already looking less pale as fluids began to replenish his dehydrated system. But his eyes remained fixed on Harrison with an intensity that made the older man profoundly uncomfortable. "Grandfather," Tommy said softly, testing the word like it might break if spoken too loudly. "Can I ask you something?" Harrison's chest tightened at the title. "Anything, son." "Why did you and my dad stop talking? What happened between you?" The question Harrison had been dreading since the moment he'd realized who Tommy was. Around the room, conversation ceased entirely as everyone waited for his answer. This was the moment of truth. Would Harrison Blackwood continue the pattern of pride and stubbornness that had destroyed his relationship with his son? Or would he finally find the courage to admit his failures? Harrison pulled up a chair beside Tommy, matching his grandson's eye level just as he had earlier. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 13 years of regret. "Your father wanted to serve his country. He believed in duty, honor, sacrifice. All the values that my father, your great-grandfather William, had tried to teach me when I was young. But I had forgotten those lessons. I'd become so focused on building wealth and power that I saw your father's idealism as weakness." Tommy's brow furrowed in confusion. But serving in the army isn't weak. Dad saved people's lives. You're absolutely right. But I was too proud and too stupid to see that. When your father told me he was enlisting instead of joining my business, I told him he was throwing his life away. When he tried to introduce me to your mother, to show me pictures of you as a baby, I refused to listen. I told him that if he chose the army over the family business, he was no son of mine. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Tommy's young face struggled to process the magnitude of his grandfather's cruelty, not just toward Michael, but toward everyone who'd suffered as a result of that broken relationship. "So, my dad died thinking you hated him," Tommy said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. "Your father died believing that his own father hated him, and your mother struggled alone because she didn't know she had family who could help. And you—" Harrison's voice broke completely. "You grew up without grandparents, without uncles or cousins, without the support system that every child deserves, because I was too proud to admit I was wrong." Tommy was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Around the room, the guests watched this family reckoning with varying degrees of discomfort and fascination. Some of them had their own estranged children, their own relationships sacrificed on the altar of ambition and success. "My dad never stopped loving you," Tommy said finally. "Even after you said those things, even after you turned him away, he never said he hated you. Mom told me he used to talk about his father sometimes, about the good memories from when he was little. He said you taught him how to be strong, even if you forgot how to be kind." Each word was another nail in the coffin of Harrison's old life. His son had maintained love for a father who'd rejected him, had passed down positive memories despite being cast aside. The generosity of spirit it must have taken, the strength of character, was humbling beyond measure. "Your father was a better man than I ever was," Harrison said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "And somehow, despite having no help from me, he and your mother raised an extraordinary son." Tommy's hand found Harrison's, small fingers wrapping around weathered ones. "He always said family forgives family. Maybe it's not too late for us to be a family?" The simple question shattered the last of Harrison's defenses. 70 years of careful emotional control crumbled as he looked into his grandson's eyes and saw not judgment, not anger, but hope. This child who'd lost everything, who'd been abandoned by the system and failed by the world, was offering forgiveness to the man who'd set all his suffering in motion. "I don't deserve forgiveness," Harrison whispered. "Maybe not," Tommy agreed with startling honesty. "But I need family. And you need to learn how to love people instead of hurting them. Maybe we can help each other." Around the room, 40 witnesses to this moment of grace found themselves confronting their own relationships, their own children and parents and siblings who might be waiting for phone calls that never came, for apologies that pride prevented them from offering. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the resort, something fundamental had shifted. The evening that had begun with casual cruelty was ending with the kind of forgiveness that could heal generations of wounds. But even as grandfather and grandson found each other, the specter of loss hung over them. Somewhere in Denver, Sarah Sullivan lay dying, and time was running out for the family that was finally, desperately, trying to come together. Sometimes it takes a child's voice to remind us what we've forgotten about love. In tonight's story, we witnessed Harrison Blackwood, a man who built an empire but lost his soul, discover that his greatest treasure wasn't in his bank account, but in the grandson he never knew existed. How many of us have let pride build walls where bridges should be? How many Christmas dinners have passed in silence because we were too stubborn to pick up the phone? Tommy Sullivan, at just 12 years old, showed more grace under pressure than most adults demonstrate in a lifetime. He forgave a grandfather who had abandoned his father, chose love over resentment, and reminded us that family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to show up even when it's hard. As we watch Harrison race against time to save his daughter-in-law and build a relationship with his grandson, we're forced to ask ourselves, what relationships in our own lives are worth fighting for? What words of forgiveness are we still waiting to say or hear? Sometimes the greatest inheritance we can leave isn't money. It's the example of a heart that learned to love before it was too late. Discussion questions. Have you ever had to choose between pride and family? What happened? And what would you do differently today? If you could have one conversation with a family member you've lost touch with, what would you say to them? Please share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear tonight. The storm outside Denver General Hospital was finally beginning to weaken as Harrison's convoy of emergency vehicles wound through the treacherous mountain roads toward the city. It had taken 6 hours to make what should have been a 3-hour journey, 6 hours during which Tommy had slept fitfully in the back of the medical transport vehicle while Harrison sat beside him, watching over his grandson like a guardian angel learning his duties. Dr. Rodriguez had insisted on accompanying them, her medical equipment and expertise proving invaluable as they navigated roads that challenged even the most experienced drivers. The Colorado National Guard had cleared a path through the worst of the drifts, their emergency authorization coming directly from the governor's office after Harrison had made a series of increasingly desperate phone calls. "Status report from the hospital," Marcus said quietly, handing Harrison a satellite phone. His loyal manager had insisted on coming despite the dangerous conditions, bringing with him a team of Harrison's best security personnel and enough medical equipment to stock a small clinic. Harrison took the phone with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of a man confronting the accumulated weight of 70 years of choices. "Dr. Cameron?" "Mr. Blackwood, I'm glad you're close. Mrs. Sullivan's condition has deteriorated since you spoke with Tommy earlier. Her brain activity is decreasing and her vital signs are becoming increasingly unstable." The words hit Harrison like physical blows. They were so close, just another hour to reach the hospital. But time was slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means that if your grandson wants to say goodbye in person, it needs to happen soon." "I'm sorry to be so direct, but I don't want to give you false hope." Harrison looked down at Tommy, who was stirring in his sleep, small features peaceful in a way they hadn't been while awake. How do you wake a child to tell him his mother is dying faster than expected? How do you prepare a 12-year-old for the moment when hope finally runs out? "Tommy," Harrison said softly, gently shaking his grandson's shoulder. "Son, we need to talk." Tommy's eyes opened immediately, alert in the way that children who've lived with uncertainty learn to be. "Are we there? Can I see Mom?" "We're almost there. But Tommy, Doctor, Cameron just called. Your mother, she's getting sicker. We need to prepare ourselves for the possibility that—" Harrison's voice failed him. Even with all his business experience, all his practice delivering difficult news, he couldn't find words gentle enough for this moment. Tommy sat up slowly, his young face already beginning to understand what his grandfather couldn't say. "She's dying faster, isn't she?" The directness of the question, delivered without self-pity or dramatics, demonstrated a maturity that broke Harrison's heart. "Yes, son, she is. Will I get to see her? Will I get to hold her hand?" "I promise you will. Whatever it takes, whatever strings I have to pull, you're going to see your mother." Tommy nodded, accepting this news with the same quiet courage he'd shown all evening. "Grandfather, when Mom dies, What happens to me? The question Harrison had been dreading, though he'd known it was coming. You come home with me, son. You become part of my family, my responsibility, my... He paused, searching for the right word. My greatest privilege. Even though I don't know how to be rich? Even though I might embarrass you in front of your friends? Harrison's laugh was half sob. Tommy, you could never embarrass me. You're the finest person I've ever met, and I include your father and great-grandfather in that assessment. If anything, I'm worried I'll embarrass you. Dr. Rodriguez looked up from monitoring Tommy's IV. We're about 15 minutes out. Tommy, how are you feeling? Any dizziness or nausea? I'm okay, Tommy replied, though his pale complexion suggested otherwise. I just want to see Mom. I want to tell her about meeting Grandfather, about learning Dad's real name, about all the family I never knew I had. And you will, Harrison promised. We're going to walk into that hospital together, and you're going to tell your mother everything. You're going to let her know that you'll be taken care of, that you'll never be alone again. The convoy crested a hill, and suddenly the lights of Denver spread before them like earth-bound stars. The storm was clearing, revealing a city that glittered with life and possibility. Somewhere in that maze of lights was a hospital where Sarah Sullivan lay dying, waiting for her son's voice to guide her home. There, Dr. Rodriguez pointed to a cluster of buildings in the distance. Denver General. We made it. As their vehicles navigated the final stretch of road, Harrison found himself thinking about timing, how the most important moments in life often hung on the thinnest threads of chance and circumstance. If Tommy hadn't appeared at his window tonight, if the storm hadn't trapped them together, if a 12-year-old boy hadn't possessed the courage to sing for strangers, none of this reconciliation would have happened. Grandfather, Tommy said quietly, are you scared? Harrison considered lying, considered offering the kind of false reassurance that adults typically provided to children in crisis, but Tommy had earned honesty through his own remarkable courage. Terrified, Harrison admitted. I'm terrified that we'll be too late. I'm terrified that I won't know how to take care of you properly. I'm terrified that I'll make the same mistakes with you that I made with your father. Tommy's small hand found his again. But you're here now. That's what matters. You came for us when we needed you. Actually, Harrison said, his voice thick with emotion, I think you came for me. I think you and your father and your mother and my father all conspired to save me from becoming a monster completely. The hospital loomed ahead of them now, its emergency entrance blazing with light. Medical personnel were already waiting. Harrison's advance team had ensured that everything would be ready for their arrival. As their convoy pulled into the emergency bay, Harrison felt the weight of the moment settling over him like a mantle. This was it. The next few hours would determine whether Sarah Sullivan lived to see her son grow up, whether Harrison could build a relationship with his grandson, whether 3 generations of Blackwood men could finally break the cycle of abandonment and pride that had defined their family for 50 years. Are you ready, son? Harrison asked as the vehicle came to a stop. Tommy straightened his shoulders, calling up reserves of strength that seemed impossible in someone so young. I'm ready, Grandfather. Let's go bring Mom home. Together, grandfather and grandson stepped into the Denver night, walking hand in hand toward a hospital where love and loss were about to collide in ways that would reshape both their lives forever. Behind them, the storm clouds were finally breaking apart, revealing stars that had been hidden but never gone, much like the family bonds that distance and pride had obscured but never truly severed. The next few hours would test everything they'd learned about forgiveness, about love, about the courage it takes to hold on, and the greater courage it sometimes takes to let go. But whatever happened, they would face it together. A grandfather finally learning to love and a grandson teaching him how.